Hi everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students, and we are back here today with Lisa Hill from the University of Adelaide. And we are very happy to talk today at the IAPSS World Congress in Brisbane again about another topic, which is compulsory voting in Australia, effects, public acceptance, and democratic justification. So I'm very happy that you're here today with us.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Awesome.
And I want to start first with your book. You've co-authored a book, Compulsory Voting, Yes and No, and you have taken a very clear position in this book. Can you explain this position a bit?
Well, Jason Brennan is against compulsory voting. So Cambridge University Press has a series, For and Against, and they take particular issues, and one takes one side, one takes the other. So we didn't write the book together. I wrote my half, he wrote his half. He's against compulsory voting, I'm for it. Why am I for it? Is that what you're wondering?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have compulsory voting, you have more complete information about the wishes of the electorate. In a voluntary system, only the well-off vote. Older citizens vote, homeowners vote, permanent citizens vote, people, long-standing citizens vote, white people vote. The young don't vote, the disadvantaged don't vote, the homeless don't vote. So in response to that, governments just pay attention to voters, which is well-off people. Under compulsory voting, government attention changes. It switches over to everyone. So there's more redistribution, more social spending, more spending on health, education, social services, and less on defence. Also, compulsory voting regimes have less political corruption. Nobody really knows why that is, but I think it's because you have more attentive people, more people watching. You don't have as much of a campaign finance problem because people are already mobilised to vote, so money's not so important in elections. Thirdly, it's just much harder to buy everyone's vote when everyone's voting, so vote rigging is much harder. But I would like to do some more research on what the causal mechanisms are there. But we do know that there are lower levels of corruption in compulsory voting regimes. And there are high levels of citizen satisfaction with the way democracy is working. Citizens aren't stupid. They can see when their democracy's a joke, and they can see when it's working well.
Mm-hmm. As I think you've researched on it from different perspectives.
Yeah.
Also, what are the philosophical backgrounds, or the democratic philosophical backgrounds to this argument?
You mean what are the arguments for and against?
Yeah.
Well, so libertarians will often say it's an unjustified violation of personal autonomy. And I argue that, yes, it is a violation of autonomy. When you're required to vote, you have to do something that you might not otherwise have done. But it's actually quite a minor infringement on your rights compared to other problems of collective action, like having to pay your taxes, having to send your children to school, having to serve on duties. Yet these are all important collective action problems that everybody quite happily goes along with because they understand that, say with paying your taxes, all right, if I refuse to pay my tax, I have the freedom to hold on to all my money. But I can't actually go anywhere because there are no roads, no trains, no airports. And if I walk down the street, I'll be robbed at any time because there are no police. So people see it as a reasonable imposition on their autonomy. It's the same with compulsory voting. While on the one hand, it's a minor infringement on your right not to vote, if there's such a thing, which there actually isn't. I've written a paper on it if you're interested. But in return, you get the protection of a lot of other freedoms. For example, the freedom not to be discriminated against by governments, and freedom of equal treatment. So now, the other thing that's protected is one vote, one value right that we all have in a democracy. So it protects a lot of rights and freedoms, a lot of negative freedoms and a lot of positive freedoms. The right to a good education, the right to health, that sort of thing. In terms of the democratic value of choice to abstain, people often say, well, the point of democracy is it exists to allow us to do nothing if we don't want, to not be politically active if we don't want. And it undercuts the idea that voluntarism is quite an important thing. Now, that is a good point. It does undercut that idea, but that argument is sort of trying to convey the impression that voluntarism is the defining characteristic of democracy. It's one of the benefits of living in democracy, just like anybody else. I don't like being compelled to do a lot of political action or things I don't feel like doing. But voluntarism isn't the defining feature of democracy. Self-government is. So in order to promote self-government, we actually take a little bit of freedom away, and in return we get a lot of democratic values returned to us and enhanced by that. One vote, one value, legitimacy, responsiveness, representativeness, less corruption. We get a lot more for our money in terms of what we have to give up. So they're the basic arguments. I think it does take away from democratic freedoms. It does, to a certain extent, take away from liberal freedoms, but it gives so much more back that it's well worth it. It's justified. It's justified.
Mm-hmm. And should it be enforced?
Yes, I've done a study with a colleague of mine, Jonathan Louth, and we looked at the effective enforcement. And also Wolfgang Höxi has also done a study on this, and it's just shown that if you don't have some sort of sanction, if you don't have a proper enforcement, it doesn't work. But at the same time, the sanction cannot be too harsh. First of all, if the fine's too high, it's going to disadvantage the poor, and we don't want that. We're trying to help the poor, not hurt them. But there has to be some sort of a fine, maybe $20, $50 seems to do it. The other thing is there has to be follow-up. So say here in Australia, our electoral commissions will send you a letter after each election saying, oh, I noticed you didn't vote. All you have to do is write back and say why you didn't vote, and they'll forget it. If you don't write the letter back, then it's a fine. So you might not even be fined. You might only just have to write a letter. They handle it in a very light-hearted way. They don't go crazy on you. They don't throw you in jail. They don't fine you a lot of money. I mean, Luxembourg, for example, fines people over $800. That's too much. We have very, very low fines. It's almost symbolic, but it's symbolising that it is the law and that there is a penalty if you don't do it, and that seems to be enough to get people to comply. In any case, Australians don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've been referring now to Australia a couple of times. Does compulsory voting have different effects in different countries, or which trends are the same and which trends do differ in different countries?
If the system's an authentic democracy that has all the correct, the right levels of freedoms, right democratic institutions, the whole apparatus, the effects are the same. If you have a compulsory voting regime in a place that's basically an autocracy and that they're using compulsory voting to manufacture consent, the effect's different. You get much less satisfaction, you get a lot more blank ballots and things like that. But across the board, Sarah Birch has written a very nice book on the empirical effects of compulsory voting, and basically it works the same way almost everywhere. It reduces the gap in voting participation between women and all other minorities, and it causes governments to be more responsive to everyone, including the disadvantaged, not just the well-off.
Mm-hmm. In recent years, in some countries that have compulsory voting, the numbers of acceptance rates have gone down. Let's say, for example, in Brazil.
You mean public acceptance of compulsory voting?
Yes.
They don't like it.
How do you explain these trends in these years, and what do they mean for us, basically?
I think that will probably be young people. Mm-hmm. We used to have a situation where the young people here liked it just as well as the older people, sometimes more. Now young people here are less approving of compulsory voting. And this is something happening the world over in industrialised democracies. Young people are liking democracy less. A lot of young people don't even think democracy is the preferred regime. They think something else could be better. They're not sure what, but they're not even sure. And you see in a lot of places, young people giving their votes away, not voting. So they're withdrawing from mainstream politics, they're not voting, and they're not approving. What they're doing instead is online activism, signing petitions, but they're not involved in mainstream politics, which is a problem because governments are responding by ignoring them. And then, so the situation is that young people feel upset that governments ignore them, so they don't vote. They don't vote, so governments just ignore them some more. That's how it works. Governments attend to voters, not non-voters. If you don't vote, you don't count. It's that simple. So I would think, I don't know much about the Brazilian situation right now. I just saw a recent very interesting study about compulsory voting there, but it's not this one. But I would put my money on the fact that it's probably young people doing what young people everywhere else are doing.
So are you looking at decisions that are also legitimized through compulsory voting? Do you find this decision making is always more legitimate, or let's say the outcome of a policy is or government policy is always more justified when there is compulsory voting? Can we draw this connection as well?
Well, I think we can. I think we can safely say that compulsory voting, Parliament's elected under compulsory voting, as long as all the other conditions are there, as long as it's an authentic democracy with all the proper civil and political freedoms, they're more legitimate because we've got all the information we need. We've got the information from everybody. There's less pork barrelling, there's less corruption. Everyone's signed the social contract. This isn't just a surmise on my part. People in compulsory voting regimes are happier with the way their democracy is working than people that aren't living in them. So the system's working better and people are happier with them, so that they're perceiving the system as responsive to them, and decisions, I'm assuming, as more legitimate.
Mm-hmm. We have actually questions coming in, and Thomas asks, in Belgium also compulsory voting, but since the Interior Minister stated that she wouldn't pursue non-voters anymore, the participation rate dropped with a few %. That's more a...
Well, I'd be very surprised if she didn't know that was going to be the effect of not pursuing it. You have to pursue it. The studies tell you that. And the data tells you that, even if there wasn't a study, just, crunching and analysing those numbers. We know that if you don't follow up, you're not going to get compliance. So you need to... Does the person concerned know why the Interior Minister decided to do that? Was she trying to depress turnout?
We are waiting then for another answer. In the meantime, there's one, I think, counter argument. What about the blatant buying of votes to people in need and those who easily accept lies, as in the experience of developing countries? This goes along with the problem of a lack of transparency and limits of party funding in elections. In this case, the argument for non-compulsory voting is strong. Well,
I agree. I would not recommend that anyone adopt compulsory voting until they have an authentic democracy in place. By the same token, because it's just going to be used in all kinds of different ways to forge consent and to legitimise one-party contests and things like that. It's not good. Mind you, Vanuatu and Samoa are just legislating right at this minute to introduce compulsory voting to fight corruption. So I was asked what I thought about that, and I was a bit worried. But then I looked at what their scores were on Freedom House. They're both scoring 2s. You'd get 1s in your country, we get 1s in our country. 2s aren't bad, but they're doing it to try and deal with the problem of vote buying. So if you've got a fairly okay democracy in place but still got some corruption problems, it actually could come in and solve some of those problems rather than exacerbate them. But again, it depends on the extent of the problem. Mm-hmm. And the extent of your level of democratic development.
All right, but for example, liberal democracies that are consolidated, you would always recommend compulsory voting as being a legitimate. Sure.
What I'd also like them to do is move to a proportional system. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of wishes. Compulsory voting is better where you have more meaningful choice. You're herding people into safe seats that they can never get any representation in. It's not great. So I'd like people to move to a preferential or proportional system first, then get compulsory voting. That would be my only qualification, I think. Otherwise, full steam ahead. If you manage them properly, as they're managed extremely well here, it's an honour system. There's no ID requirement. It has a culture of a high level of trust and honesty around it. We don't have corruption scandals and problems like that. High levels of satisfaction with it. If it's managed very well, it'll work very well in any developed setting. Mm.
We have by now one more comment by Thomas. He said she was from the Liberal Party trying to remove compulsory voting, so making it an empty box.
Yeah. Well, then so she's going to be saying people don't really want to vote. Yeah, I don't want to really comment anymore because it'll be two-party political, but to me it looked like there was something going on there beyond just wanting to save money. It was something else going on. It's a great way to depress turnout. But actually... And it may be depressing turnout among her constituency. Against an opposing constituency. She wants to raise turnout among her voters and depress it among her opponents' voters.
Yeah, but that actually leads us to a very interesting point because we've been speaking about public acceptance and also policies a lot. But is there, in your research, are there any findings about which political parties or which, whether more progressive or center party politics, conservative politics, take advantage of it?
There's conflict. Some studies conclude it benefits parties of the left, which shouldn't surprise us because it embraces the poor. And some studies say it has a neutral effect. But it's my feeling that it probably benefits parties of the left.
With two more comments, Girmish mentions, how did you see also de facto compulsory voting designed to legitimate elites by increasing voter turnout in Africa?
I didn't quite understand that question. What's de facto compulsory voting?
Maybe, Girmish, you can clarify your point a bit. In the meanwhile, I would go to Sophia's question. Sophia mentions, in Mexico we just had elections and there was a very high percentage of participation. We think that you should be mandatory to vote, but when you show the importance of citizenship, it may be that this obligation is not necessary. In this way, there would be a dispute between participation and compulsory voting.
I don't understand that question either. Did you understand what it said? So you think that she thinks that there should be compulsory voting in Mexico?
No, I think her point was that the obligation to have compulsory voting is not necessary, stated in the sentence before.
Because they had turnout in Mexico?
Yeah, so basically I think one interesting debate that follows from that is compulsory voting really the necessary approach? Do we have to force people to vote, or are there other softer means to make it clear for the population to go to the ballots?
Look, governments the world over are doing everything they can to raise turnout without using a coercive measure, and of course it's always preferable, if you want to get a result, to use a non-coercive way. But there's really no other mechanism that is as decisive and as effective as compulsory voting. People say lower the voting age, put voting booths in malls, move voting to Saturday. There's lots of different ways lower the voting age. There's lots of different ways you can raise turnout, but most they'll give you is about 7%. Compulsory voting can give you up to 30% jump in voting turnout, and it's immediate. That's the thing about it. It happens straight away. You don't have to wait for trickle-down effects or electoral education. Or governments for years have been trying to convince people that they have a duty to vote, but they still don't. If you made a list of all the things that can raise turnout, if you did all those things at once, they still wouldn't be able to raise turnout to the degree that compulsory voting does. So it's really the only decisive mechanism. The other thing that's good about it is not only is it immediate, you don't have to have a fancy or controvertible theory about why people aren't voting. Everyone's got a theory about why people don't vote. Oh, people are becoming cynical about politicians. Well, what are we going to do about that? Young people don't want to vote anymore. I can't legislate against youth. I can't stop being, I can't do anything about the fact that young people are floating away and absorbed in screens or whatever it is that they're doing, signing petitions. The greatest correlate of failure to vote is having little or no education and being poor and disadvantaged. We would all love to get rid of the root causes of abstention, poverty and low education levels among certain people. That's going to take a long time if it ever happens. The good thing about compulsory voting is once you introduce it, you actually can start dealing with those problems. The things that are causing disaffection in the first place can be solved by compulsory voting. Once you get people in the voting habit, things start working better. Things start being people are less poor and therefore more inclined to vote. The young are attended to better. Politicians are less cynically likely to be corrupt or do pork barrelling, which turns people off and makes them abstain. So it makes the system work better and it makes people happy about voting anyway. So it's a solution with a lot of virtues. The only bad thing about it is its coerciveness. It is a coercive mechanism. But as long as it's handled with a sensitivity, without going nuts on people if they don't vote, making them feel like they're the worst criminals on earth, just take a light hand with a light penalty and it will work.
Maybe a question coming to an end of our discussion here. You've mentioned in the very beginning that there are other policy tools that are actually far more in contrast or far more conflicting with certain freedoms that people have and enjoy in democracies. How is it then that compulsory voting is not established in many democracies, even though, as you put it, it is a far the conflicting character of it is far less acute as for other things?
Is your question that look, we require people to go to duties, yes, go on juries, they make them send their kids to school, make them pay taxes? That's far more coercive, and yet people will do it. Yes. Yeah. It's odd, isn't it? Because it's just that people think of democracy as all about what you feel like doing. They don't sort of see it as something that actually requires work and collective effort. And if we don't all put in some effort, we're free-riding on each other, and after a while then we're eroding that democratic condition, and we're causing it to degenerate into a kleptocracy or a gerontocracy or an oligarchy or whatever other corrupt forms you can think of. So it seems like a very reasonable imposition on people to keep their democracy from dying, because it is after all constituted by participation. It's not a constitutional form, it's an activity, it's performative. So it always amazes me when people say, oh, how can you stand being compelled to vote? And Australians think nothing of it, because all the transaction costs here are covered by the state. It takes 2 minutes to vote. There are never any long queues. We never run out of ballots. The government does all the registration. It's just a fun thing to do on your way to the beach or something like that. Why won't other people have it? I just think it's something that we started off with, and so we're all used to it. People just think it's very inimical to the idea of democracy. And what I was saying before about thinking that voluntarism is one of the defining features of democracy. So it's kind of a mystery to me. If I could just get people to come here and watch one of our elections and see how pain-free it is, they would change their mind. And if I could also get people to understand that, the analogy I often use is, say a tyrannical regime, one of our neighbours, wanted to invade us and to turn us into one of their satellite tyrannies, take our freedom away and turn us into a despotic state. We would all be willing conscripts in the war to defend ourselves from tyranny, so we didn't lose our democracy. And that's how I think of voting. It's just one thing we have to do. We're willing conscripts so that afterwards we can all enjoy the freedom and benefits of living in a properly functioning democracy where there's more social spending, less military spending, more health spending. So it's a pretty minor infraction of freedom considering the amazing things you get from it. So look, it's a mystery of science to me, but it's just that it's such a rare phenomenon that people can't get their heads around it. But if they just went to an election and saw how well run they are and how easy it is, they'd probably change their minds. But I am trying to change their minds, and hope I'm slowly succeeding.
Lisa Hill, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Tobias.
We are very happy that you joined us for our Facebook Live, and wish you all the best for the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
And
you too.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Goodbye.